And joining us now in studio is Richard Westbrook, Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Westbrook, you've spent most of your professional career as a climate scientist in the public sector.
Yes, 10 years as a supervisory management analyst in the Office of Environmental Information. And before that, I was a program specialist in the EPA's Resource Management Division.
And you have a PhD in climate science from Stanford.
Yes, and another in chemistry with a master's in biology.
Just so we know what we're talking about, if you were a doctor and we were the patient, what's your prognosis? 1,000 years, 2,000 years?
A person has already been born who will die due to catastrophic failure of the planet.
What did he just say?
About a week after I saw this episode of The Newsroom, I started noticing a number of new books on climate change. Titles such as The Last Hours of Humanity and The Sixth Extinction were as dire as they were eye-catching. In The Last Hours of Humanity, the author Tim Hartman presents a future not too different from the one of the fictional EPA director. All of the books focus on the fact that the 5 major mass extinctions in history have all started with rapid global climate change, and they claim that we are setting ourselves up for just such an event again. Now, I'm not a climate scientist. I believe in climate change, but usually steer away from any debate because I don't feel that I know enough. After hearing so much about how the Earth may soon become unlivable, I decided that I wanted to learn more. The problem was, when I went to look up climate change debates, I usually found things like this.
Let's let Nick answer.
So, I know in 2004, I think it was, you said global warming was a total crock of shit.
Yeah. Because I'm going to show the CO2 correlation. Yes, I agree. I also agree.
Joe. After trying to watch numerous debates on climate change, I came away with the fact that there was really only one person who knew what they were talking about, and that was John Oliver.
And it's always one person for, one person against, and it's usually the same person for.
Bill Nye and Marsha Blackburn, welcome both of you to Meet the Press.
Bill Nye joins us now, along with climate change skeptic Mark Morano.
Joining me now to go head-to-head, Bill Nye, science educator and CEO of the Planetary Society.
In the crossfire, Bill Nye, the science guy.
Bill Nye, the science guy who believes in man-made global warming. Yeah, that's right. More often than not, it's Bill Nye, the science guy, versus some dude.
Now, I love Bill Nye. I grew up watching him, but for some reason, he didn't seem to be presenting the facts in a very articulate or persuasive way. It probably doesn't help when you go on Bill O'Reilly with handheld charts. Now, I don't know if they made him use those, but it just makes him look like some old guy who doesn't know how to use those newfangled computers. With nowhere to turn for answers and a nagging fear in the back of my head, I decided I had to do something. Why not take a few of the most often heard arguments as to why climate change isn't happening, or at least isn't man-made, and test them out? Instead of simply taking Bill Nye for his word that those other people are wrong, why not look up the answers for myself? Thus, this video was born. Now, before I get to all that, I should probably take a moment to introduce myself. For the past 9 years, I've been doing this. This also explains some of the reason why I want to understand climate change. As a pilot in the United States Air Force, I directly contributed more to the release of emissions into the atmosphere than 99% of the people on this planet. This is a picture of the fuel flow gauges of the KC-10 during takeoff. Every time we went wheels up, we were burning over 40,000 pounds of jet fuel an hour. That works out to about 1.5 gallons per second. I burned more fuel in a single mission than I will ever use in my entire life of driving a car. And I want to know if all of those emissions are causing any problems. So what are some of the big questions? I went back and parsed out some of the good information from all of those debates that I listened to, because it isn't as if people are just shouting at the wind. Those arguing against climate change do have facts to point to. What I want to know is how truthful those facts are.
Because they lost the temperature battle, we're going on 15 to 18 years, depending on one of the 5 major data sets of not only no global warming, but if you go to 2001, you've got global, statistically very slight global cooling.
And one more additional thing is, if you want to start fooling with when you're going to pick the starting dates, how about let's start the starting date right here in 1998, where the temperature's the warmest, and look at that trend. This is where the temperature is now, and that's 1998, the warmest year on record.
Now, this came up a lot. Almost every commentator who spoke against climate change pointed out how the temperature of the Earth has stopped going up in recent years. So the question is, has the temperature of the Earth stopped increasing over the past decade, and if so, why? It turns out that this is absolutely true. If you look at the climate data put out by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, there can be no doubt that in recent years the temperature has stopped increasing. These temperatures are taken by satellites, so there is little to debate about the measurements themselves. So the question is why? Since I have a background in physics and astronomy, the first thing that came to my mind was the sun. The sun goes through cycles of increasing and decreasing activity about every 11 years. Thus it seemed likely to me that this could be the cause of the delay in the warming. When you take the same chart of temperatures from NOAA, remove all of the background and superimpose the line of the sun cycles, this is what you get. Ever since the 1970s, whenever the sun's activity goes down, the increase in global temperatures slows. So that was my first thought, and it turns out that this actually is pretty accurate. Many scientists do agree with this theory, especially since right now the sun has been going into exceedingly low levels of activity. But there are also other explanations, and many of them could be working in concert. The oceans seem to be absorbing a lot more of the temperature increase than expected, thus leading to the die-off of coral reefs around the world. Volcanic eruptions can also temporarily cool down the planet. The point is, scientists can explain what is happening. Though it may have been unexpected, that doesn't mean that the underlying theory is wrong.
They blame, a new study out this week is blaming the somewhat reduced Arctic ice. And by the way, they started Arctic ice monitoring in the late 1970s at the high point of the global cooling scare. So we have lost a little ice. However, the Antarctic ice has expanded to record levels at the South Pole. Global sea ice is now currently third highest on record. They don't want to combine the poles or talk about the sun. They only want to talk about the area where they've lost ice.
The next question is regarding sea ice. We all hear about how the Arctic is losing all of its summer sea ice and thus polar bears are being stranded without food because of the warming. However, several people talked about the Antarctic and how ice is actually increasing there. So, is the Antarctic gaining ice, and are we actually gaining ice globally? For this one, I had no theories. So let's go straight to the experts.
The increase that we're seeing in the Antarctic extent is a little bit of a mystery.
Wait a minute. Did he just say this was a mystery? Not looking very good for the experts.
We're seeing overall temperatures warming around the globe, so you would expect to see ice loss. Some people have looked at the Antarctic increasing trend and used that to suggest that global warming isn't happening, or that the increase in the Antarctic is offsetting the decrease in the Arctic. And that's simply not true. If you look at just simply the magnitudes of the changes we're seeing, in the wintertime, the Arctic is decreasing about twice as fast as what the Antarctic is increasing.
So here again we have an explanation. Though the Antarctic is gaining ice, it isn't as fast as the Arctic is losing ice. In my research, I also found a couple of other things. There is a big difference between sea ice coverage and the total amount of sea ice that is present. If the ice is very thin, it can cover more area without actually increasing the amount of ice. When scientists measure the amount of ice, there has been a big drop-off globally. Although there are several explanations as to why the Antarctic is gaining ice, the foremost one is the hole in the ozone layer, which allows more heat to escape from the lower atmosphere, lowering the temperature near the South Pole.
Just look at the answer to our Crossfire quiz. Cows, that's right, cows are responsible for releasing more greenhouse gases in a year than 25 million cars or burning a year's worth of oil in the Keystone Pipeline.
This poll question from CNN is just one example of another common complaint about climate change theory. Even at today's elevated levels, carbon dioxide still only represents 0.04% of the Earth's atmosphere, with people often referring to it dismissively as a trace gas. So the question is, how much impact can human emissions, particularly carbon dioxide, have on the global climate cycle? Before I get into any research, I need to apply some basic logic to this question. First, let's deal with the CNN quiz. If you're going to be honest, then you need to be comparing apples to apples. That's not at all what they did here. First, they compare all the cows in the country to 25 million cars. The problem is, there are over 250 million cars in the United States. The proper way to frame this question would be, which causes more emissions? All of the cows in the United States, or 1/10 of the cars in the United States. That doesn't sound nearly as dramatic. There is also a problem with the comparison to the Keystone Pipeline. Right at the end of the clip, you hear the correspondent say how cows will emit more than burning a year's worth of oil from the pipeline. The problem with this is that no one has ever been worried about the amount of oil coming from the Keystone Pipeline. The concern is over where the oil comes from. The oil from tar sands is very energy intensive to produce. Lots of Canadian forest is being clear cut, and the whole process involves creating a lot more emissions than getting oil out of a traditional well. Just like with the cars, this is a false comparison.
But since 1998, CO2 is going next to nothing because the Earth's temperature is flatlining and CO2 is coming up. So what you have to believe, folks, is this, that the sun plus the oceans plus the volcanic activity plus natural reversal has less effect than the yearly human contribution equal to the width of a hair on a 1-kilometer bridge of a trace gas needed for life. So if you want to believe that, you can go ahead and believe that.
Next, let's deal with the problem of dismissing something just because it's a trace gas. It takes only 100 parts per million of carbon monoxide to be dangerous to humans, and it takes just 500 parts per million of particulates in the air to make Beijing look like this. I bring all of this up because it is important to make sure that we are having a real debate. What effect does carbon dioxide have on the atmosphere? This is a real and important question. Answering the question by saying it is just a trace gas and can't possibly affect anything isn't factual. We need more information. First, there's the correlation argument. By using ice cores from Antarctica, we can look back at the atmosphere for the last 400,000 years and discover that there has always been a correlation between global temperature and carbon dioxide. The correlation is easy to see and it's very strong. Still, as any good statistician will point out, correlation does not equal causation. There could be some other factor driving the actual warming, and CO2 is just the byproduct. This brings us to the greenhouse effect. Study of the greenhouse effect goes back to the early 1800s, but the primary proof came in 1996, and it comes in the form of this chart, which will probably take a little bit of explaining. To start, you need to understand that by examining the wavelength of light coming off of an object, you can tell what that object is made out of. This is how we know the sun is primarily made of hydrogen without actually taking a sample from the sun's surface. For this experiment, a couple of scientists looked up into the sky and measured the amount of radiance, or radiation, being reflected back at the Earth from the atmosphere at different wavelengths. Clearly, water is very important. This is why cloudy nights are generally warmer than clear nights, because the clouds hold in a lot of the heat that's trying to radiate back into space. But right up there with water is CO2. Despite being a much lower percentage of the atmosphere, it still reflects a great deal of heat back towards the planet. So that about answers that question for me. Not only do we have a very strong correlation backed up by years of climate data, but we also have physical proof of CO2 causing extra warming.
What about the fact that is the overwhelming consensus of all the climate scientists?
That's not true.
This is one of the most important questions to answer. Is there actually a consensus among scientists? The figure that you hear most often is how 97% of climate scientists agree with climate change, and it comes from a study published in 2009. This study sent an invitation to be a part of a survey to 10,257 Earth scientists. Of those 10,000, they received 3,146 responses. Of those responses, approximately 82% answered yes to the question, do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor to changing mean global temperatures? The study then went on to limit results only to climatologists. This left them with 79 responses, 77 of which agreed with the above statement. This isn't the only study though. In 2004, a study of a decade's worth of peer-reviewed papers on global climate change found that every paper which took a stance on the cause for climate change agreed that it was caused by humans. In 2010, a study looked at just the research papers from those scientists who have made public declarations regarding climate change. They initially began looking at the works of 1,372 researchers, but later imposed a lower limit to the number of publications a researcher needed to be a part of in order to be deemed an expert. They wound up with 908 researchers who had authored at least 20 publications, and found between 97 and 98% supported man-made climate change. The Vision Prize and the Consensus Project have also published results supporting the figure that 97% of climate scientists agree with man-made climate change, But many might discount those studies because both of those groups are seen as in favor of the idea that climate change is real, making them biased. There have also been countless scientific organizations around the world which have come out in support of man-made climate change, not to mention the National Academies of Science from 80 different nations. It is safe to say a lot of people have signed on with this. All of these studies are disputed with things like the Global Warming Petition Project, which claims to have the signatures of 31,000 scientists who agree there is no scientific evidence for climate change. However, there are a few problems with this. First, it is not confirmable. The petition is circulated by mail, and there is no realistic way to confirm the results or that the signatories are actual scientists. But I still believe most people generally tell the truth, so let's take them at their word. 31,000 scientists. That sounds like quite a few. The problem is that according to the Congressional Research Service, there were 687,900 life and physical scientists employed in the United States in 2012. Even by that number, which wouldn't include other scientists or anyone who is retired or unemployed, the petition represents only 4.5% of American scientists. Short of reading thousands of scientific papers myself, this is about as close as I can get to determining the truth about scientific consensus. But this just brings us to the next problem brought up by climate change deniers.
And they've perfected it, but it's not science, and it's really bastardizing any notion we've ever had of science. And it's because of the funding, it's because of the corruption that the funding entails. We have the United States government, the United Nations, foundations, universities. You know, someone made the crack, 97% of scientists paid to say global warming is real produce global warming propaganda.
Is the consensus financially driven? This one is hard to directly dispute because it is an ad hominem attack, meaning that it is an attack on the person giving the argument rather than on the argument itself. Not only is this a logical fallacy, making it tough to dispute with logic, there is no way for me to understand the motivations of every climate researcher on the planet. The government does spend a lot of money on climate research, as do a lot of other organizations. But then again, does that actually mean anything? For a while, there was a lot of money going towards studies showing cigarettes cause cancer. That's because they actually do. This is really a circular argument. Because all of the studies show climate change is real, and all of those studies cost money, then all of the money is being spent on studies proving climate change. There are a lot of very big industries which would benefit if climate change was proved not to be real. Why aren't they spending their money on that kind of research? If you believe in market forces, then the place where the majority of money flows will likely be the correct direction. Energy companies are not spending a lot of money on research to disprove climate change because it is a losing investment. Like all good conspiracy theories, this one is impossible to disprove, but just based on a logic test, it doesn't hold up as a rational argument. Now we are going to have to go to one final set of problems.
1978 is an interesting date to start it. Basically, in 1978, this is the time where John Holdren and his contemporaries were saying there was a global ice age coming. The reason they started...
Name me one prediction of the International Panel of Climate Change, which made predictions in 91, 96, 2001.
They're all worse. They're worse than they predicted.
No.
Yeah.
The oceans were going to get hot.
This is the final argument I want to look at because it goes to the heart of scientific discovery. Predictions have been made for years now. Are the predictions by climate scientists true or false? The Ice Age remark is probably one of the true sore spots in climate science. I wasn't around at the time those predictions were made, but it's true. Back in the 1970s, the fear was that we were heading into a new ice age. And that's because of this chart again. If you put yourself in 1970, there's a definite trend downward. Now first, we need to remember that past incorrect results don't mean future results will be wrong as well. The fact that people once thought the Earth was flat doesn't call into question that it is indeed round. Second, the cooling trend from the 1940s through the 1970s has actually been explained and incorporated into climate models. You see, after World War II, industry expanded like crazy. No environmental regulation and a limitless demand from a world which had just been destroyed by war. Most of these industries were very dirty and released large amounts of things like sulfur dioxide into the air, which actually cool the planet. These particulates serve to reflect light back into space just like a volcanic eruption. Then the 1970s roll around, environmental regulation starts to get put into place, and those particulates fall out of the atmosphere. allowing the greenhouse effect to dominate the global climate cycle. This is another explanation for why we are seeing temperatures stabilize today. If you notice, since 2000, sulfur dioxide levels have been rising. This is largely because of China, which has been growing in much the same way the United States did after World War II. Their excessively dirty industries are working to cool the planet in the short term. But enough about old predictions, what about current predictions? The first release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change happened over 2 decades ago. Surely we can see some of the results by now.
It's the oil, stupid. It's the oil.
Security forces will use all measures. The world is almost out of water.
First, let's talk about temperature again. In point of fact, we were not supposed to be in a desert wasteland by now, but it is true that we are at the lower end of temperature projections. We already talked a little bit about why, but here are the actual predictions. Compared with the first report from the IPCC, we are well below where temperatures were expected to be, but for others, we are somewhere in the middle or the lower third. So things aren't as scary as the projections, but we are still inside the predicted levels. We have already talked a little bit about sea ice as well, but we can also talk more about polar ice in general. For sea ice, we are well ahead of the expectations. Things are a lot worse than the models predicted. As for polar glaciers, like the ones in Greenland, well...
We're 60 years ahead of the worst case scenarios of only 5 years ago. The IPCC report just came out, and we're 60 years ahead of worst case scenarios.
Things are actually pretty bad on that front, and not just in Greenland, but also Antarctica.
This morning, scientists believe the melting of major glaciers around the South Pole is past the point of no return. The western Antarctic ice sheet is the size of California and Texas combined. Researchers at NASA and the University of California say it's melting faster than predicted.
In both places, we are well ahead of where any scientists predicted just a few years ago. So melting ice takes us to the final prediction we will look at: ocean levels. Why aren't cities being swallowed up by now? Well, because they were not supposed to be. In 2001, the IPCC predicted a 2 millimeter per year rise. What we have actually seen is 3.3 millimeters per year. The observed rise has been at the very top of the predicted range by the IPCC, mainly because the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are melting much faster than expected. So in general, reality has been in the range of predictions, and besides temperature, most things are on the bad end of the spectrum. So what do we do now?
What would all this look like?
Well, mass migrations, food and water shortages, spread of deadly disease, endless wildfires, way too many to keep under control, and storms that have the power to level cities, blacken out the sky, and create permanent darkness.
We want to inform people, but we don't want to alarm them. Can you give us a reason to be optimistic?
Well, that's the thing, Will. Americans are optimistic by nature. And if we face this problem head on, if we listen to our best scientists and act decisively and passionately, I still don't see any way we can survive.
Okay, Richard Westbrook, Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.